The torches didn't warn her. That was what Eustacia would remember long after the screaming stopped. Not the cold, not the hands that grabbed her, not the sound of the earth splitting open beneath Shadow Ridge like a wound that had waited years to bleed. She would remember the torches, how they burned steady and bright in the hands of the people she loved, how not one of them trembled. She had walked to Shadow Ridge willingly. She had smiled the entire way there. The ridge itself was ancient, a slash of black rock cutting through the northern forest like a scar the land refused to heal. The trees that grew near it were wrong. Too tall, too still, their bark pale as bone, their branches reaching inward instead of toward the sky. No birds nested here. No wolves hunted along its edges. Even the wind moved differently at Shadow Ridge, slower, heavier, as though the air itself did not want to disturb whatever lived beneath the stone. Eustacia had never been this far north. She had no reason to be suspicious. Beowulf, the council elder whose word shaped the pack's every decision, had called it an assignment. Important work. The kind of work they trusted only to loyal members. She had felt proud. She felt it still, even as the warriors closed around her. Dagar on her left, Sven on her right. 2 men she had trained beside in the packyard. 2 men whose children she had watched grow. Their hands closed around her arms before she understood what was happening. The grip was not the grip of escort. It was the grip of purpose, of something long practiced. "What?" she started. The word didn't finish. Rope, thick and rough-woven, bit into her wrists. Someone yanked it tight from behind. She spun instinctively, wolf reflexes firing, but there were too many of them and she was outnumbered before she'd processed that she needed to fight. "Runa!" Her voice came out broken, a child's voice, the voice of the 12-year-old girl who had once been alone in a winter forest with nothing but hunger and fear. "Runa, what is this?" The old woman stood at the edge of the gathering. Her white hair caught the torchlight. Her face, that face Eustacia had memorized the way orphans memorize the first kind face they ever see, did not move. The lines around her eyes were deep. Her lips pressed together so tightly they had gone pale. She did not answer. "Asmund?" Eustacia turned to him, and this was the moment that would haunt her longest. Her mate, like the man whose hands she had fallen asleep holding 1,000 knights. He stood 3 paces away, jaw set like iron, eyes fixed on the stone at his feet. He would not look at her. He would not look at her. And that was when the first crack split something open inside her chest, something she had no name for yet, because the mind refuses to name a wound while it is still being made. Beowulf stepped forward. He was a large man, broad across the shoulders even in old age, his gray beard braided in the old style. His expression held no cruelty. That was the worst of it. He looked at her the way a farmer looks at a field he is about to harvest, not with hatred, but with the calm of a man completing something he began a long time ago. "The pack thanks you for your service, Eustacia," he said. She didn't understand the words. She heard them. She simply couldn't fit them into any shape that made sense. The ground at the center of the ridge began to shake. Not violently. Not like an earthquake. It trembled with a kind of awful patience, as though something beneath it had been waiting and was only now allowing itself to stir. A sound rose from the stone, low, resonant, felt more in the chest than heard with the ears. The torchlight around the circle flickered despite the still air. Shadows pooled at the center of the ridge faster than shadows should. The rift opened like an eye. A seam of absolute darkness splitting the black rock from edge to edge, exhaling cold air that smelled of iron and old earth and something else. Something beneath language. Something that made the wolf in Eustacia flatten against the inside of her ribs and go very, very quiet. No. She pulled against the ropes, hard. Her wrists tore. She didn't care. "No, Asmund, look at me." He looked up then, just for a moment. And the thing she saw in his face was not the face of a man following orders. It was the face of a man being destroyed by something he could not stop and did not know how to survive. His eyes were wet. His jaw was shaking. He looked at her the way someone looks at a person they are losing and cannot reach. It did not save her. The warriors dragged her to the edge. She fought with everything she had. She bit, she kicked, she threw her weight sideways, she screamed his name until her voice split. The darkness below had no bottom. It breathed. She could feel it breathing. They threw her in. The cold swallowed her whole. 15 years earlier, she had been easy to find. That was the part no one would ever tell her. How little effort it took. The trackers Beowulf sent north had covered 2 days of ground before they found the girl huddled beneath a fallen pine, wrapped in a man's old cloak, 2 sizes too large, eating roots she had pulled from frozen ground with her bare hands. She was 12 years old, and she had been alone for 3 weeks. The wolves who found her watched from the tree line for a full hour before reporting back. Orphan, they said. No pack scent. Pure stray. No one looking for her. Perfect, Beowulf said. Runa had been chosen for the approach because she was old, and her face was soft, and there was something in her eyes that read as grandmother, before it read as anything else. She had wrapped the girl in a fur blanket and pressed warm bread into her frozen hands, and said words so gentle they had no edges. You don't have to be alone anymore. Come with me. We will take care of you. Eustacia had wept. She had wept and eaten and wept again, and she had followed Runa out of the forest without once looking back at the place she had survived. She didn't know she was walking into a different kind of trap. The pack received her warmly. Genuinely, in most cases. The deception lived only at the council level. The women who taught her to cook over pack fires had no idea. The children who pulled her into games in the yard had no idea. The warrior who first put a practice blade in her hand and told her she had good instincts had no idea. For years, Eustacia breathed in the warmth of belonging and believed every single breath of it. She was gifted with her hands. She learned to track, to preserve food stores, to stitch wounds when the healers were overwhelmed. She rose before dawn, and she was the last to sit. Not because anyone asked her to. Because gratitude had no off switch inside her. Every morning she woke in a warm bed in a pack that had chosen her. She felt the echo of the frozen ground she'd slept on before, and she worked to repay a debt no one had asked her to acknowledge. Runa watched her with an expression that over the years became genuinely difficult to read. On council meeting days, the old woman's eyes held a guarded distance. On every other day. When Eustacia brought her evening tea without being asked. When she braided the white hair with careful hands. Even when she laughed at Runa's dry humor and called her the closest thing she had to a grandmother. Those eyes held something else entirely. Something that looked alarmingly like love. Something Runa clearly had not planned for. She said nothing. She kept her silence and her place in the deception, and she loved the girl anyway, quietly and with a grief she never put into words. Eustacia turned 20 and didn't notice the shift in how the council watched her. Asmund arrived 3 weeks after her birthday. He didn't announce himself. He simply appeared in the pack yard one morning during weapons training, watching from the fence with his arms crossed and a look on his face like he was calculating distances. He was tall, dark-haired, with the kind of stillness that comes not from calm but from control. A man who had learned early that motion costs energy, and energy is currency. His eyes were gray, the particular gray of winter sky right before snow. And when they found Eustacia across the yard, they stayed there a beat longer than necessary. She ignored him. She was in the middle of a drill. He respected that. He didn't approach her until she had finished, cooled down, and poured water over her own head at the trough. Only then did he come to stand beside her, and his opening words were not flattery or pretense. Your footwork in the third sequence is off, he said. "You're favoring your left before the pivot. Opponent with any experience will read that and take your right side." She turned and looked at him. "I know," she said. "I broke my right ankle when I was 11. It healed wrong." He considered this. "Show me the sequence again." That was how it started. For 3 months, they trained together every morning. He corrected her footwork with a patience she found startling in someone who otherwise seemed to have very little tolerance for imprecision. She corrected his tendency to underestimate opponents smaller than himself. They argued about technique with an intensity that the other pack members found amusing, and neither of them noticed because they were too absorbed in being right. By the 4th month, she realized she was looking for him before she looked for anyone else when she entered a room. By the 5th month, he had brought her wildflowers. Not ceremoniously. Just set them on the fence post before training without comment, as though they had appeared there on their own. She picked them up and said nothing, and tucked one behind her ear, and he trained the entire morning with his jaw slightly tighter than usual. By the 6th month, the pack was calling them mated before either of them said a word about it. The ceremony was small, which was what Eustacia wanted. She had no blood family to fill a large gathering, and the absence of that fact, even at the happiest moment of her life, sat in the corner of the room quietly. Runa walked her in. Runa's hand on hers was warm and steady, and Eustacia gripped it harder than she meant to. "You deserve this," Runa said quietly, in the moment before they stepped forward. Eustacia didn't hear the weight inside those words. She was too happy to hear anything but their surface. The council established the rule quietly, packaged inside tradition. There was a custom, Beowulf explained, for certain unions, a period of spiritual restraint before full consummation, to honor the bond properly. 1 year, perhaps more. It was presented with such solemnity, wrapped in so much ceremony and ancestral language, that Eustacia received it as sacred. She spoke to Asmund about it that night with a sincerity that made something move behind his eyes, something he hid quickly before she could read it. He agreed to the custom. He held her that night as though the holding itself was an argument he was losing. The years built slowly, and the warmth inside them was real, regardless of the architecture of deception underneath. Asmund proved to be a man of unexpected depths. He was quiet in the ways that mattered. He listened without interrupting. He noticed things other people missed. He remembered small details about what she said in passing, and returned to them weeks later in ways that made her feel heard in a way she hadn't known she was starving for. He made her laugh. He could not cook, but he tried with such disastrous sincerity that she laughed every time, and he seemed to accept her laughter as sufficient payment. She loved him, completely, without reservation. He loved her back, and this was the part that had not been part of any arrangement. As Eustacia's 26th year moved through its seasons, something changed in Asmund. She noticed it first in the way he held her, tighter sometimes, as though measuring something against a deadline she didn't know existed. He began watching the council sessions from across the yard with a look that she could not categorize. Not suspicion. Something colder. She asked him once what was wrong. He said, "Nothing," and touched her face, and looked at her the way a man looks at something he is trying to memorize. She didn't ask again. She trusted him too completely to press. That winter, on a night when the wind cut hard through the pack settlement and the fire in their hearth had burned low, Asmund broke the custom the council had ordained. He held her face between his hands and looked at her for a long time before he spoke. His expression had the quality of a man who had made a decision after a very long war with himself. Not peaceful exactly, but resolved. Like someone who had stopped fighting in a particular direction and turned to face something else entirely. "I love you," he said. His voice was rough. "Whatever happens, whatever you learn, I need you to know that first." She didn't understand what he meant. She understood the love. She had never doubted it. She reached up and covered his hands with her own. "I know," she said. and so the custom broke. And so the council's careful architecture developed its first and only crack. Asmund lay awake long after she slept, staring at the ceiling, one arm around her shoulders, his jaw tight in the dark. He had bought her time. He did not know if it would be enough. He did not know what the shadow would do when it discovered its payment had been altered. He knew only that he could not deliver her to that rift untouched and call it anything but murder. Whatever came next, he would bear it. What came next arrived on the morning of Eustatia's 27th birthday, in the form of Beowulf standing at their door, smiling, with news of an important assignment. And Eustacia, grateful as ever, said yes before he had finished asking. She packed her bag with care. She kissed her mate in the doorway. She walked north through the forest at the side of the people she loved most in the world, watching the trees change as the temperature dropped, noticing the birds disappear, feeling the air grow heavier with every mile, telling herself it was only the altitude. She smiled the entire way there. The torches were already lit when they arrived. The darkness inside the rift was not empty. She fell for what felt like a long time, long enough to stop screaming, long enough for the cold to move from her skin into her bones, long enough for her mind to stop trying to explain what was happening and simply receive it. She hit nothing. There was no bottom, only a gradual cessation of falling. A slow arrival into stillness as though the dark itself had decided to hold her. She stood in absolute blackness and her own breathing was the loudest thing in the world. Then the shadow moved. It did not appear. It shifted. The darkness rearranging itself into the suggestion of presence, enormous and ancient and aware in a way that bypassed the senses and went straight to the oldest part of her wolf brain. It had no face she could name. It had weight. It had attention. When that attention turned fully toward her, Eustacia felt it like pressure on every surface of her body simultaneously. The shadow studied her. A silence that lasted and lasted. Then something changed in the quality of the dark. It was not anger yet. It was something that preceded anger. The silence of something realizing it has been deceived by creatures far beneath its power. The stillness of something deciding what to do about that. When it finally spoke, the voice came from everywhere and nowhere, felt in the chest like the lowest note of an instrument with no name. You are not what was promised. Eustacia opened her mouth. Closed it. You are not virgin. You are not pure blood of the pack. The darkness pulsed. Cold air moved through the rift like breath. They sent me astray, and they sent me a broken promise. A pause that pressed against her ribs. Shall I show you what they did not tell you? Eustacia stood in the dark at the bottom of the world where her pack had thrown her, and she thought of Runa's warm hand on hers at the ceremony. She thought of Asmund's face at the ridge, the wet eyes, the shaking jaw, the way he had looked at her like a man watching something he could not stop. Yes, she said. The darkness bloomed, and she saw everything. The first days, if they were days, she spent in a state that was not quite consciousness and not quite sleep. The shadow did not speak to her constantly. It allowed silence, long stretches of it, in which she had nothing to do but think and remember and feel the full, uninsulated weight of what had been done to her. She thought about Runa finding her under the fallen pine. She thought about warm bread pressed into frozen hands and a voice saying, "You don't have to be alone anymore." She thought about 15 years of mornings in a pack that felt like home, about the work she had done, the gratitude she had carried, the careful, cheerful effort she had poured into belonging. All of it, every single morning of it, built on top of a decision made before she arrived that she was not a person to be welcomed, but a resource to be managed. She thought about Asmund. His face at the ridge kept returning. The wet eyes. The shaking jaw. The way he had looked at her as the warriors dragged her to the edge, like a man watching something he could not stop. She had loved that face. She had memorized it over years. She had believed she knew every expression it was capable of making. She had not known it was capable of that one. The grief and the fury were not separate things inside her. They occupied the same space, fed from the same source, each one making the other larger. Every time she reached for a warm memory, the betrayal beneath it was there waiting. And every time she tried to process the betrayal, the warmth of what she had believed made it worse. There was no clean way through it. There was only the having of it, full and unrelenting, in the dark. The shadow watched her go through this. It did not interfere. It waited. And as the weeks passed, she counted them eventually by the rhythm of her own sleeping, rough and imprecise, but something. It began to speak to her more. Not constantly. Carefully. The way something patient and purposeful introduces an idea. It showed her the council chamber again. The scroll. The voices. Find a female stray. Young. No ties. No one to ask questions. It showed her Runa receiving her instructions. The expression on the old woman's face. The expression Eustacia had spent 15 years reading as love. Visible now from the outside. From this distance. For what it also was. Calculation wearing the mask of warmth. A role assigned and accepted. She knew from the beginning, the shadow said. Every cup of tea, every braid, every time she called you her heart's child. She knew. Eustacia sat with that image and felt something in her chest go very quiet and very cold. It showed her Asmund. His assignment delivered in the same torchlit chamber. The instructions clinical and clear. Get close. Keep her stable. Make sure she remains untouched. A tracker following orders. A mission with a human face. He came to you as a weapon, the shadow said. Everything he offered was a leash dressed as love. He broke the custom, Eustacia said. He consummated our marriage. That's why you couldn't. He broke the custom to preserve the pack's asset, it said. A damaged offering serves no one. When he realized the payment date was approaching, he recalculated. He protected his investment. She wanted to argue. She found in that moment that she couldn't. Because she did not know. She could not know from inside the dark at the bottom of the world what had moved in him that winter night. She had only what she'd believed and what the shadow was telling her. And she had already proven catastrophically wrong about the things she believed. The cold spread through her from the inside. You gave them everything, the shadow said, and its voice had changed. Not softer, but closer, more direct, aimed at the precise location of her wound. 15 years of work. 15 years of gratitude for something that was never generosity. You rose before dawn for people who were counting the days until they could discard you. You called them family. You meant it. They never did. Eustacia pressed her hands flat against the dark floor beneath her and breathed. They took a child with no one, it continued, and they used that loneliness against her. They let her build her whole life on a foundation they planned to remove. And when the time came, they put ropes on her wrists and threw her into the dark and walked home. Stop, she said. They are at home right now. The shadow's voice did not stop. It did not raise. It simply continued, relentless and precise. The fires are lit. The children are in the yard. Beowulf is in his council chair. Runa is pouring tea. Asmund is in the house you kept for him. They have completed their transaction, and they have returned to their lives, and not one of them is losing sleep over what they did to you. Something cracked in Eustacia's chest. Not broke, cracked. The distinction mattered. A break is sudden. A crack spreads. You deserved none of what they did to you, the shadow said. You were a child. You were alone. You asked for nothing except to belong somewhere. And they looked at that need and they decided it made you useful. The crack spread. They should answer for it. She was crying. She hadn't realized it until she felt the cold on her face. She pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes and held them there and breathed through her teeth, and the grief moved through her like a flood through a broken dam, unstoppable now that it had found the gap. 15 years of trust and warmth and belonging, dissolving into the knowledge of what it had all been built on. And underneath the grief, feeding on it, growing larger with every image the shadow pressed into her mind, the anger. Not the hot, volatile anger that burns fast and leaves ash. The cold kind. The kind that builds in the dark over weeks of sitting with the full truth of what was done to you. The kind that doesn't want to shout, and the kind that wants to return. They should answer for it, the shadow said again. This time she didn't argue. Yes, she said. The darkness stirred. Something in it sharpened with the quality of a thing that has been waiting for a particular word. Then go back to them, it said. Go back and let them see what they discarded. Let them understand that the girl they threw into the dark did not disappear. Let every one of them stand before what they chose and receive it. And the pack? She said. The ones who didn't know? The council made the deal. The council signed the scroll. The council chose you. Hold them accountable. A pause. The rest, that is your judgment to make. She looked at her hands in the dark. I will give you what you need, the shadow said, not as a gift, as a correction. What was owed to me will be collected differently. The power entered her the way a storm enters a valley, from all directions at once, total, claiming every space simultaneously. She gasped, and then couldn't gasp because there was no room left in her lungs that wasn't already full of it. It moved through her like cold fire, like shadow given intention, like the oldest and least forgiving version of the wolf she had always carried. Her hands blazed with it, light and dark wound together, inseparable. Two things that should oppose each other existing in perfect and terrible cooperation. She felt herself expand, not physically. The wolf in her deepened, became something that had no name in the pack hierarchy, because it was not in the hierarchy. It was above it. It answered to nothing she had ever been taught to answer to. The rift opened above her like a wound reopening. Cold night air fell down to meet her. She rose. She stepped out of Shadow Ridge on a night that looked nothing like the night she had entered it. The season had turned. A full month had passed above ground while she sat in the dark and learned the shape of her own betrayal. The trees around the ridge had shed their remaining leaves and stood bare and silver-black under a sky thick with stars. The ground was hard with early frost. Her breath misted in front of her face. She stood on the black rock and looked south toward the pack settlement and felt the power steady and quiet in her hands, like something that had always been there and had only now been permitted to wake. A month. They had been home for a month. She thought about that as she walked south through the dark forest, moving without sound now, the frost-hardened ground not registering her footfalls, the shadows pulling slightly toward her as she passed, as though they recognized something in her they wanted to follow. A month of normal mornings, fires lit, children in the yard, meals prepared, pack business attended to. A month of Beowulf in his council chair with his transaction completed and his pack secured. A month of Runa pouring tea. A month of Asmund in the house she had swept and aired and filled with the small accumulated details of a life she believed was hers. Did they think about her? She found, walking south through the bare trees, that she was not sure she wanted the answer to be yes, because if they thought about her with guilt, it meant the guilt had not been enough to stop them. And if they did not think about her at all, that was its own verdict on what she had been to them. She kept walking. The settlement appeared through the trees in the way she had always loved. The warm glow of it visible before the buildings were, firelight and hearth smoke reaching out through the dark like a welcome. She had always felt, approaching the settlement at night, that the light was meant for her specifically, that it was waiting. She stopped at the tree line and looked at it. The warmth of it hit her in the chest, and the cold the shadow had built there hit it back, and for a moment she simply stood between them, feeling the collision. Then she walked out of the trees. The first person to see her was a young boy crossing the yard with a bundle of firewood, his breath pluming in the cold. He stopped, looked at her. The firewood dropped from his arms piece by piece as his expression moved through confusion into something that had no name yet because he was too young to have a name for it. "Eustacia?" he said. She looked at him. Column. She had watched him learn to walk. She had treated the cut on his forehead 2 winters ago when he'd fallen from the fence. "Go inside, Column," she said quietly. "Tell the adults I'm here." He ran. She stood in the center of the pack yard and waited, and the power moved slow and patient in her hands, and the darkness gathered at the edges of the torchlight, the way shadows gather at the edges of fire. Not defeating it, simply reminding it that it is surrounded. The settlement woke around her. Voices first, the particular sound of a community processing information too strange to process quickly. Then faces at windows. Then people in doorways stopping when they saw her. Then, inevitably, footsteps from the direction of the council hall, heavier, purposeful. Beowulf came out first. He crossed the yard and stopped 10 paces from her and looked at her with the same expression he had worn at the ridge. Not fear, not guilt, that grim, resigned quality of a man encountering a possibility he had calculated and accepted. He looked at her hands, at the power visible there, at the darkness gathered around her like a cloak that moved independently of the wind. "You came back," he said. "You didn't think I would," she said. "No. That was your second mistake," Eustacia said. "Your first was taking me in the first place." She looked past him. The pack was filling the yard now. The women from the fires, the warriors from the barracks, the elders from their houses. All of them stopping when they saw her, the procession pressing outward from every door and halting in a loose, stunned circle. She saw the faces she loved, and the faces she had trusted, and the faces she had worked beside for 15 years, all of them wearing versions of the same expression. Shock layered over guilt, layered over the specific human fear of being made to account for something. She scanned the crowd. Runa was near the back, as though she had tried to position herself where she might be missed. The white hair caught the torchlight. The old woman was looking at her with an expression so stripped of pretense it was almost unbearable to see. No council meeting composure, no grandmother performance, just the raw, open face of someone who has been found out and no longer has any use for the mask. Eustacia held her gaze for a moment, moved on. Asmund was not in the yard. She would find him, but not yet. She turned back to Beowulf and the gathered pack, and she let the silence do its work. Let it stretch until the weight of it was something physical, something the whole crowd felt pressing on their chests. And then she spoke. Not loudly. She had learned in the dark that volume was what you used when you were not sure you were being taken seriously. She was certain. "I know everything," she said. "The shadow showed me. The deal, the scroll. The trackers sent north to find a girl with no one. Every decision your council made from the night I was 12 years old until the night you put ropes on my wrists." She paused. "I want the council members who signed that agreement to step forward. Now." The yard was absolutely still. Then one by one they came. What followed moved with a terrible clarity, the kind that only exists when a person has had a month in the dark to understand exactly what justice requires and why. Eustacia named each council member as they stood before her. Not because they had forgotten their own names, but because naming is the oldest form of making something real. And she had been unnamed for too long. Had been thing and payment and stray in their private language for 15 years, and she would not perform mercy before she had performed truth. Beowulf stood in the center of them, with his jaw set and his shoulders back, and did not beg. She gave him that. When the power moved through her hands and the reckoning reached him, She held his gaze until the end, because she would not dishonor even this by looking away. The others received what they had agreed to when they signed the scroll. The pack watched in silence. When it was done, Eustacia stood in the center of the yard, and the cold stars burned overhead, and the pack around her had not moved, not fled, not reached for weapons. They stood in the particular stillness of people who understand they are witnessing something they earned. The power in her hands settled into a low, steady warmth. Still there. Still ready. She looked at all of them. And then, beneath the anger, beneath the cold the shadow had built in her, beneath the month of grief and darkness and the careful, patient work of learning how thoroughly she had been deceived, she felt the other thing move. It was smaller than the anger. It should have been weaker. It wasn't. She looked at Colum, frozen near the fence where he had dropped his firewood. She looked at the women from the fires. She looked at Runa. Despite everything, despite all of it, she still loved this pack. Not the deception, not the council, not the transaction signed in the dark. The home, the real one, the one she had built herself from work and gratitude, and the daily small decision to believe that belonging was real. That home existed. It had been real. The lie underneath it did not make it retroactively hollow. It made it painful, which was different. She was still deciding what to do with that distinction when Asmund appeared in the doorway of their house. He had heard everything from inside. She could see it in his face, hear it in the complete absence of surprise in his expression. He stood in the doorway and looked at her across the yard, and made no move toward her, and no move away. And his face had the quality of a man who has accepted that he is at the end of something and is trying to meet it with whatever dignity he has left. She looked at him. All the things the shadow had told her about him were in her hands, like stones she was holding. A weapon dressed as love, a leash dressed as tenderness, a mission accepted without hesitation. But she also remembered the morning in their 4th month of training when he had set wildflowers on the fence post without comment. She remembered the way he trained the rest of that session with his jaw slightly tighter than usual. She remembered him lying awake after the council's custom was broken, staring at the ceiling in the dark, one arm around her, and she had not known then what the darkness on his face was. She knew now. She looked at her mate across the yard with the power of the shadow in her hands and the cold of a month's grief in her chest, and she felt the question pressing up through all of it like a root through stone, demanding air. Was any of it real? She did not ask it yet. She was not ready. The ground shook. It started beneath her feet and moved outward, not the trembling of the rift, but something older and larger and directional, coming from the north. The bare trees at the settlement's edge shivered as one. A sound followed, felt before it was heard, rising through the frozen earth in a vibration that bypassed the ears entirely and went straight to the base of the skull. The warriors reached for weapons on pure reflex. Eustacia turned north and felt it with the shadow's senses now. Felt the scale of it. Felt what it was and how long it had been waiting, and how the only thing that had stood between it and this settlement for 15 years was an agreement that no longer existed. The pack's enemies had felt the border go down. And they were coming. She stood in the center of the yard, with the power alive in her hands. And the pack, her pack, the one that had betrayed her, the one she still loved, the one she had not yet decided about, stood behind her. And ahead of her the northern tree line was moving with something that had been patient for 15 years, and was patient no longer. Whatever she chose in the next few moments, she would choose it for the rest of her life. She did not move toward the tree line, not because she was afraid. The power in her hands had no fear in it. It was too old for fear, too certain of itself. She stood in the center of the yard and felt the approaching threat moving through the frozen ground like a tide, and she made her choice in the space of a single breath. the way the most important choices are always made. Not after long deliberation, but after long preparation. The decision arriving already formed because everything leading to it had already done the work. She turned to the pack. "Get the children inside," she said. "Warriors to the northern perimeter. Now." Nobody questioned it. That was the thing about authority that comes from something real. It doesn't need to announce itself. The pack moved. Mothers pulling children toward doors. Warriors breaking from their stunned stillness into the trained efficiency of people who know what to do when the threat is external, even when the greater wound is internal. The yard cleared in seconds. Eustacia walked north. She walked through the settlement gates and into the bare trees beyond, and the power moved with her, the shadows gathering at her edges, the cold air parting ahead of her, as though it recognized something it did not want to obstruct. Behind her, she heard the pack falling into formation, not because she had commanded it, but because this was what packs did, what they were built for, the old muscle memory of collective survival taking over when everything else had broken down. What came out of the northern dark was large and organized, and had clearly been waiting for exactly this moment. Some 3 packs consolidated into a single war party. She could smell the different pack signatures layered over each other like bad harmonics. Rival groups who had agreed to set their differences aside long enough to take what they believed was suddenly unprotected. They had scouts. They had been watching the border. The moment the shadow's protection lifted, they had begun to move. They were not expecting her. She stopped at the tree line and raised her hands, and the power rose with them. What she released into the northern dark was not violence in the way the pack understood violence, not claws and teeth and the physical collision of bodies. It was older than that. It moved through the trees in a wave that the attacking wolves felt before they saw it, a pressure in the air that carried a single unmistakable message. This territory is held by something you have no framework for, and the cost of continuing forward is higher than any prize at the end of it. The advance stopped. She could hear it, the sounds of organized movement losing their rhythm, the commands breaking apart into confusion, bodies that had been driving forward beginning to recalculate. She stood at the tree line in the dark and let the power speak, and it spoke in a language that required no translation for any creature that had ever encountered something older and larger than itself. They turned back, not in panic, in the careful, deliberate retreat of warriors who have assessed new information and made a professional decision. She watched the sounds of them recede northward and fade, and the forest went quiet around her, one element at a time. First the movement, then the scent, then finally even the distant vibration in the ground, until all that remained was the cold and the bare trees and her own steady breathing. She lowered her hands. Behind her, the pack waited. She turned and walked back through the gates, and every face in the yard turned to her, and she looked at all of them. The warriors still in formation, the women in the doorways, the children pressed against windows, and she felt the love and the anger and the grief all occupying the same space inside her chest, none of them winning, none of them retreating. She looked at Runa first. The old woman had not gone inside. She stood near the well at the edge of the yard, wrapped in a heavy shawl, her white hair loose around her shoulders. She looked smaller than she had in the forest. Not physically, in the way that people look smaller when the thing that was holding them upright turns out to have been pretense. Eustacia crossed the yard and stopped before her. Runa did not look away. She received the full weight of Eustacia's gaze with the steadiness of someone who has decided that the least they can offer is the honesty of not flinching. "How long did it take?" Eustacia asked, "before it stopped being an assignment?" Runa's mouth pressed together. Her eyes were very bright. 2 weeks, she said. Perhaps less. Her voice was rough. "You were so hungry. You ate the bread so carefully, like you were trying to make it last, like you didn't believe there would be more." She stopped. Started again. "I told myself I could keep the 2 things separate. the task and the feeling. I told myself for 15 years. Could you? No. The word came out without hesitation, without qualification. No. I loved you from the second month. From before the second month. I told myself it didn't change the obligation. The pack needed protection. The deal existed before you arrived. I told myself you would have a good life, a full life, that what came at the end was... She stopped. There is no way to finish that sentence honestly. No, Eustacia said. There isn't. Runa's hands were shaking inside the shawl. I am sorry, she said. I know what that costs in the face of what I did. I know it doesn't reach far enough. But it is the truest thing I have. Eustacia looked at her. Really looked, at the way she had learned to look since the shadow opened her eyes, searching for the seam between performance and truth. She searched the old woman's face, and she found the guilt, and she found the genuine grief of someone who had made a terrible choice, and had spent 15 years living inside its consequences without being able to speak about them. She also found the love. It was not a clean love. It was complicated and compromised, and built on a rotten foundation. But it was there, real, persistent, the kind of feeling that refuses to die just because the circumstances that grew it were corrupt. She thought about the bread, how carefully she had eaten it, how Runa had watched and not said anything, just quietly passed her more. The crack in her chest spread a little further, and then, unexpectedly, it began to close. Not fully. Not yet. Perhaps not for a long time, but closing. I'm not finished being angry at you, Eustacia said. I know. But I'm not going to... She stopped, found the words. You are not one of them. You chose wrong. That doesn't make you the same as the ones who signed the scroll without losing sleep. Runa closed her eyes. A tear ran down the side of her face, and she made no move to hide it. I would spend the rest of my life making it right, the old woman said, if you would allow me the chance. Eustacia looked at her for a long moment. Go inside, she said finally. You'll freeze out here. It was not forgiveness yet, but it was a door left open. Runa understood the difference. She pulled the shawl tighter, nodded once with the gravity of someone receiving something fragile and expensive, and walked toward the hearth hall. Eustacia watched her go. Then she turned toward the house. Asmund was inside. He had not lit the hearth. He sat in the chair nearest the cold fireplace with his elbows on his knees, and his hands folded between them and his eyes on the floor. And he looked up when she entered with the expression of a man who has rehearsed several versions of this moment and has recently understood that none of them will serve. The house was exactly as she had left it a month ago. That was the detail that hit her first. How ordinary it all looked, the dried herbs hanging from the beam, the mended blanket folded over the chair arm, the 2 cups on the shelf that she had bought from the market 3 winters ago because she liked the pattern on the rim. All of it sitting exactly where she had put it, undisturbed, as though the house had been waiting too. She stood in the doorway and looked at it. Asmund rose slowly. He didn't come toward her. He stood beside the cold fireplace and gave her the room and waited. Was any of it real? She said. The same question she had been carrying since the shadow first showed her his face in the council chamber. The question she had not been able to ask in the yard with the pack watching. The question that had lived at the center of her chest for a month like a coal that stayed hot regardless of everything packed around it. Asmund looked at her steadily. No, he said. At first it wasn't. She had known he would say it. She had needed to hear him say it anyway. She absorbed it, let it land fully, did not protect herself from the weight of it. Tell me the rest, she said. He exhaled. Beowulf called me in 3 weeks after your 20th birthday. He told me what you were, what the pack had planned. He said the closer the date came, the more important it was to have someone in your immediate circle. Someone who could monitor, manage, make sure nothing disrupted the arrangement. He paused. He chose me because I was a tracker and a warrior, and because he believed I was the kind of man who could do the work without the work doing anything to him. He was wrong, Eustacia said. He was wrong. Asmund's voice was quiet. I came to you with an assignment. I knew what I was doing. I told myself it was clean, that I would keep you safe, keep you stable, that the kindness was real even if the purpose behind it was not. He looked at his hands. The footwork comment was real. I meant that. I didn't know yet that it would matter. When did it change? He was quiet for a moment. There was a morning, 4 months in. You had beaten me in the third sequence. Finally got the pivot right. Used my own correction against me. You didn't say anything. You just looked at me and raised one eyebrow. Something moved in his face. I went home that evening and I sat in this chair and I tried to write my report to Beowulf and I couldn't write it. Not because I didn't have information. Because writing it felt like... He stopped. It felt like a betrayal of something that had become real without my permission. Eustacia looked at him across the cold room. And the night you broke the custom, she said, the shadow told me it was calculation, that you were protecting an asset. I know what the shadow told you. His jaw tightened. I know how it would look from the outside. I know I have no way to prove otherwise. He met her eyes. But I need you to hear this. When I held your face that night, I was not thinking about the shadow or the payment or the pack's protection. I was thinking about a morning 6 years earlier when I watched you treat a wound on Colum's forehead and you told him a story while you worked so he wouldn't focus on the pain, and I thought... His voice broke at the edge. He held it. I thought I would burn the world before I let anyone take you from it. The room was very quiet. The cold fireplace, the dried herbs, the 2 cups on the shelf. You should have told me, she said. You should have found a way. Yes. No qualification. No explanation offered as substitute. Just, yes. I would have been terrified, she said. I would have been angry and I would have been terrified and I don't know what I would have done. I know. But I would have been alive for it, she said. I would have known. I could have chosen. I know. His voice was barely above a breath. I chose for you because I was afraid of what you would choose. And that was the worst of it. Not the silence. The fear underneath the silence. That if you knew the truth, you would leave and I didn't know how to be a person anymore without you in the room. He looked at her with the raw, open honesty of someone who has nothing left to protect. I was a coward, and you paid for it. Eustacia stood in the doorway of the house that had been hers and looked at the man she had loved for 6 years and felt the full inventory of what they were to each other. The real thing, and the lie it grew inside, and the way the two were wound together so completely that she could not pull one free without tearing the other. She thought about the shadow's voice in the dark. Careful, patient, feeding her the images one by one. He came to you as a weapon, a leash dressed as love. She thought about the shadow's anger at the pack, a righteous anger, a legitimate one, the fury of something genuinely wronged. She did not doubt that. The wrong was real. But she also thought about how the shadow had used her grief, how it had waited for the right moment. Not immediately, not while she was still numb with shock, but after weeks of isolation had stripped away every comfort and left nothing between her and the pain. How it had fed her the images in a particular order. How it had pressed on each wound until the anger was larger than the love. She was angry. That was real. The anger was entirely hers. But she was also Eustacia, the girl who had learned to read people in the careful way of someone who had nothing else to read, who had spent 15 years paying attention to the difference between what people said and what they did, who had sat in a cold dark for a month with nothing but truth and her own mind and had used both. And what she knew, what she had known since the yard, if she was honest, was this. Asmund had been sent to her as an instrument, and he had become something else. She had watched it happen in real time over years, without knowing what she was watching. The man who could not write the report. The man who set wildflowers on a fence post without ceremony. The man who had lain awake staring at a ceiling in the dark after a decision that he knew he could not take back. The shadow had told her it was calculation. The shadow had also, she understood now, wanted her to return with nothing in her heart but fury. A cleaner weapon. More useful. She was not interested in being useful. "Ask me," she said. Asmund looked up. "You came all this way without asking," she said. "Ask me." His throat moved. "Can you forgive me?" The question sat in the cold air between them, unadorned, without the cushioning of explanation or justification he had carefully stripped away. Just the question in its simplest form. Eustacia looked at him for a long time. "Not today," she said. "Today is too close to everything. I am still angry. I will be angry for a while yet, and I need you to understand that I am allowed to be, and that you are not permitted to hurry me through it. I understand. But I know you," she said. "I have known you for 6 years, and I know the difference between the man who accepted an assignment and the man who sat in that chair unable to write a report. I know which one has been in this house with me." She crossed the room slowly and stopped before him. "I'm not forgiving the assignment. I'm not pretending the lie didn't happen, or that the year it would have cost me doesn't matter. Yeah, I am saying that I see both things and I am choosing to stay for the real one." Asmund looked at her, and the relief in his face was not the relief of someone who has escaped consequences. It was the relief of someone who has been carrying something alone for a very long time, and has just been told they don't have to carry it alone anymore. He reached out slowly, giving her every opportunity to step back. She didn't step back. His hand came to rest against her face with the same careful gentleness he had always had. That quality in him she had always found startling in a warrior. The capacity for carefulness when it mattered. His thumb traced her cheekbone and his gray eyes were very bright. "I'm sorry," he said, "for all of it, every day of silence, every report I should have burned, everything I chose that should have been yours to choose." She covered his hand with hers. "I know," she said. She gathered the pack the following morning. All of them, every member who remained, which was most of them, the deception having been confined to the council and the trackers closest to Beowulf. They assembled in the yard in the cold morning light, breath misting, faces carrying the particular gravity of people who had slept badly for good reason. Eustacia stood before them and looked at the faces she knew. She had spent the night thinking about what she intended to do. She had lain awake in the house with Asmund's arm around her and the dried herbs hanging from the beam and the 2 cups on the shelf. And she had turned it over and over until she knew the shape of it. She spoke plainly. "I'm not going to pretend last night resolved what was done to me," she said. "The council made a decision about my life before I arrived here. They used me for 15 years with full knowledge of what they planned. What happened at the ridge happened. The shadow showed me everything and it cannot be unshown." She paused. "But the council is gone, and the pack is still here." She looked at the faces in front of her. The women, the warriors, the elders who had not been part of the inner circle, the children peering from behind their mothers' shoulders. "Most of you didn't know," she said. "I believe that. The few who knew and kept silent, I am asking you to live with that. Not asking you to perform guilt, asking you to carry it honestly, and let it change how you make decisions going forward." She let her eyes rest on specific faces. The warrior who had held her arm at the ridge, who stood now in the back of the crowd with his eyes fixed on the ground. "That's the price. Not performance. Change." No one spoke. "The shadow's protection is gone," she continued. "What came north last night, I sent it back. That was a conversation, not a resolution. They'll test the border again when they think the power has faded. She looked at the warriors. It hasn't. I'm still here. That means this pack still has protection. Different than what it had before. Not purchased. Chosen. She felt the shift in the crowd. Not celebration, nothing that simple, but a collective exhaling, a loosening of something that had been held very tight. This is not me saying everything is forgiven, she said. This is me saying I am not willing to let what was done to me also destroy what I built here. I built something real in this pack. No one can take credit for that but me. She felt the truth of it settle in her chest, solid and unmovable. The home I found here, I made it. With my own hands. With my own work. It belongs to me regardless of what it was built on top of, and I am not leaving it. Colum was near the front. He had his firewood clutched against his chest, and his face was doing the complicated emotional work of a child processing something too large for his years. When her eyes found him, he straightened instinctively. She almost smiled. Now, she said to the pack, there is work to do. She went to the shadow that afternoon alone. She walked north through the bare trees to the ridge and stood on the black rock and called to it with the power it had given her, and the darkness gathered and the cold sharpened and the presence arrived. You did not judge them all, it said. No. The debt remains unpaid. The terms were broken. The terms were broken by the council, she said. The council paid. The rest of the pack had no part in making the agreement. She stood on the ridge in the cold afternoon light and felt the power steady in her hands and looked into the dark without flinching. I'm returning what you gave me. A silence. You would give back power? I don't want power that was given to me to be used as someone else's instrument, she said. I was that for 15 years. I'm not doing it again. She felt the truth of it clean and certain in her chest. Whatever I am going forward, it comes from me. The darkness was very still. Then the pack remains unprotected. The pack has me, she said. That's my choice to make, not yours. Another silence, longer this time. The shadow's attention moved across her in that way it had. Total, assessing, reading her the way ancient things read the creatures they cannot quite categorize. Then something unexpected moved in the quality of the dark. Something she had not felt from it before. Not softening. The shadow was not built for softening. But a kind of attention that was different from the attention it had given her grief and fury in the dark. The attention of something that had encountered something it did not expect. The pack came back to face me, it said. She turned, and she had not heard them because they moved with the collective quiet of a pack that had made a decision together. All of them, the full settlement, emerging from the tree line and crossing the black rock of the ridge in a body. Warriors and elders and women and Colum with his serious face and Runa at the back, with her white hair loose and Asmund at the front, one step behind Eustacia, his grey eyes forward. She looked at them. Asmund met her eyes. We're not letting you stand here alone, he said simply. She turned back to the shadow. The pack settled on the ridge behind her, some kneeling, some standing, all of them present, none of them running. The wind moved across the black stone carrying the cold and the scent of bare trees and frost. They are ready to be judged, the shadow said. It was not a question. They are ready to take responsibility, Eustacia said. That's different from being judged. Judgment ends things. Responsibility is what you carry forward. The darkness breathed. She felt the moment it changed. The moment something in it that had been wound tight with the injustice of broken terms and discarded debts encountered something it genuinely did not have a category for. A pack that had wronged something and come back anyway. Not to bargain. Not to offer a counterpayment. Just to stand in the place where the wrongdoing happened and be present for whatever came of it. She had never considered that the shadow might not have seen that before. That something ancient and powerful and accustomed to the full range of what creatures do when they are afraid might be encountering, for the first time, the specific thing that love looks like when it decides to stop hiding. The darkness moved. Not toward them. Away, receding, pulling back, the cold lifting by degrees, the shadows thinning at the edges of the ridge until the afternoon light reached places it had not reached in as long as anyone living could remember. The bone-pale trees at the ridge's border caught the light, and the frost on the black rock glittered, and somewhere in the distance a bird called. The first bird she had heard since they left the settlement. "The bond is released," the shadow said. Its voice was different now. Quieter, the enormous resonance pulled back to something that was almost private. "The debt is cleared. Not through payment. Through something I find I do not have a sufficient name for." Eustacia felt the power in her hands complete its withdrawal. A slow unclenching, the vast borrowed strength of the shadow returning to wherever it had come from, leaving behind only what was hers, which was, she found, more than she had started with. Not magic. Not the shadow's fire in her palms. Something quieter. Something that had been building in her since she was 12 years old and had not needed a rift at the bottom of the world to exist. Only time and truth and the willingness to look at both without flinching. She stood on Shadow Ridge in the thin winter light and breathed. Behind her, the pack breathed with her. "Go," the shadow said, for the second time. "What you build from here is yours." She went. The walk back through the forest was not silent. It started that way. The pack moving south through the bare trees, with the careful quiet of people still finding their footing after something large. But gradually, the way sound returns to a forest after a storm passes. Noise re-entered. A comment from one of the warriors. A child asking a question that made 3 adults answer simultaneously. Runa, at the back, making a dry observation to the woman beside her that Eustacia caught the tail end of and recognized immediately as the humor she had laughed at 100 times. She walked at the front beside Asmund. Their hands found each other somewhere in the middle of the forest, not ceremoniously, just the way hands find each other when they have been reaching in the same direction long enough. She did not look at him when it happened. Neither did he. They simply walked. "I meant what I said last night," she told him, quietly enough that only he could hear it. "I'm still angry. I know. I'm going to need honesty," she said. "Not careful honesty. Not honesty that's been checked for damage first. All of it. All of it," he agreed, "and you're going to learn to cook." He was quiet for a moment. "That one might be beyond what I can promise." She looked at him sideways. He was watching the path ahead with his jaw slightly tight, in the way she knew meant he was fighting a smile. She felt something loosen in her chest. Not the anger, that was still there, honest and necessary, but something alongside it. Something that had survived a month in the dark and a ridge full of reckoning and the full unfiltered truth of what had been done to her and had come out the other side still intact. She tightened her hand in his. "Try," she said. He brought her hand up and pressed his mouth to her knuckles. Brief, unhurried, full of something that needed no translation. They walked south through the winter trees toward the settlement, and the warm glow of it appeared between the trunks ahead of them, and this time, Eustacia knew the light was not waiting for her. She was walking toward it herself, on her own terms, with her own hands, with eyes wide open. That made all the difference. If this story moved you, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss the next story. Drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from and which moment stayed with you. I love hearing from you. Until the next story, take care of yourself.